We're talking about plagiarism. That's exciting stuff. I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves because I hate introducing people.
Okay.
She's throwing a curveball right off the bat.
That's
All right,
how I roll.
I'll start.
Deal.
So I'm Melissa Morris. I'm a teaching associate professor in the Statler College. I primarily teach in the Fundamentals of Engineering program, so it's our common first year.
Hi, I'm Tom Sura. I'm the undergraduate writing coordinator and associate professor in the English department. And by undergraduate writing coordinator, I mean that all the English 101, 102, and 103 courses that we're doing and the attendance policy that is so reviled, all that comes back to me. So happy to be here as well.
And I'm Lou Slimak. I'm the director of assessment in the provost's office, so I get all the fun stuff that no one else wants to deal with, like this. Like plagiarism. Any chance I get to add Kermit doing yay? Yay! I get to talk about plagiarism today. Yay! Part of the reason we're talking more and more about academic integrity is because when we started looking at the academic integrity process a few years ago, we had 100 reports for an entire academic year. Institution our size should expect about 800. So we knew we had an academic integrity problem. As I picked it up and kind of started working on it, we've doubled it the last 2 years. We hired Azealia Hulbert, who's the new director of academic integrity. If you don't know her yet, reach out. She's amazing. She's increasing it again. We're looking at probably another 50 to 75% increase again this year, so from 100 to about 600, 700 in 3 years reports. Plagiarism is our #1 problem. I mean, it's not surprising. None of this is any of those things where you're like, whoa, really? Tell me more. But big, you know, of the 400 some violations last year, about half of them are plagiarism or contain some aspect of plagiarism. And that's beyond the giving or receiving unauthorized aid, which is lawyer talk for cheating on tests with your cell phone and stuff. There's nothing even close, right? So plagiarism is the problem. The good thing about plagiarism compared to some of our other academic dishonesty problems is that we're consistent usually in how we sanction it. Because it's so common, I think departments like English, departments like the Fundamentals of Engineering program, psychology, a lot of the departments who see a lot of plagiarism have realized that they need kind of a set policy for how we're going to sanction this. If you don't have one, think about it now. We don't tend to put parameters on how you sanction, but what this shows you is that by and large, across the institution, most everyone sanctions plagiarism by changing an assignment grade. So the assignment that was plagiarized gets a reduced grade, fails, but it's limited to that assignment. And by and large, that's for everybody. You can see that there are some other people who will fail you for the course. There are a few UFs that came out of it. Change in final grades. You have that right as an instructor to set any penalty you want. A part of what Azealia Hulbert, again, that director of academic integrity, and I have been working on is educating you all what gets appealed and what gets turned over. If you get a first-time offender on plagiarism and you UF them right off the bat, they're probably going to appeal it and they're probably going to win. So, you know, think about a policy that will stick. The idea is you want those sanctions to stick as a faculty member so that they actually do learn something and suffer some consequences. This tells you, for the most part, change an assignment grade, you're pretty safe. Do you guys have, is there a department level sanction established for either of you?
No, we can do whatever we want, and then we're advised not to go to, obviously, a recommendation for a UF. So we have teaching teams, and we usually bring the offense to our teaching team, and we kind of do a collaborative assessment on what would be the best. But there's nothing like written down.
In terms of a range of sanctions, we don't have anything that right now that's like documented, kind of articulated policy for it, but we always kind of coach the instructors. We leave it up to the instructors, but we coach the instructors to kind of respond along a range. So if something's like, if it's minor, it's like a patch writing issue where the student has put in a quotation and maybe changed a couple of words. You know, we might address that through feedback. We might address it through a rewrite. If it's something more serious or there's a bigger chunk of the paper that's been plagiarized, we might do like a rewrite plus a letter grade reduction for their portfolio or something like that, and then all the way kind of up to what we kind of see as the most egregious offense, which would be like fraud, like it's just somebody else's paper, like you didn't write any of it. And for that, we might recommend like failing the course or a UF or something like that, depending on the circumstances. But so we kind of coach them along that continuum to make sure that we don't jump right to the most severe sanction right off the bat. Because the other thing that I've seen happen, and I've had to kind of coach instructors through, is like they'll see it the first time, and then with that first one, they will say, well, I'm going to let you off easy this time. I'm not going to write it up. I'm just going to have you rewrite it. And so there's like nothing. But then they see it again in the final portfolio, and at that point, it's like a personal affront, and they're really angry about it. And so they're like, off with their heads, all of the, and they go all the way to the extreme, like they want to do like failing for the course or unforgivable F, because to them, it's the second time or the third time or something like that. But institutionally, it still looks like the first time. So we've kind of had to kind of back up a little bit and make sure that people are documenting what they're doing as they're going, why they're doing it. Anytime somebody's going to apply a sanction, I typically say, like, you really need to fill out the form then, so that's documented. If it's beyond just something you would address through feedback or revision, then you need to document that so that it's on the record. And so any further things look like further things instead of first offenses, because I think sometimes those really severe penalties look like first offenses, but from the teacher's perspective, this is something they've been grappling with for several weeks or several assignments or something like that.
Actually, that's a great plug for always reporting plagiarism, even if you're sanctioning a warning, even if you're sanctioning a revision of the assignment, because we have seen a number of cases that where someone will fill out the form, say this is offense number 3 this semester, I want to fail them for the course, I want to give them the UF. The institution goes back and looks, and we don't have 2 other reports of plagiarism, we have 1.
Right.
The student appeals, they're appealing 1 sanction. It's going to be hard to uphold that. So even if you've got a warning, there's a warning on the form, you can report the warning. There are common misconceptions about where this data goes. That reporting form goes over to student conduct. It is in a database that is secure. I don't have access to it at the individual student level, and I have access literally to everything at this institution. You cannot FOIA it. Employers cannot request it. It is not a permanent record of any kind that follows the student around.
Right.
Except if you give them a UF or something on their transcript.
Right.
That then is a signal, obviously, that they have done something in that course. But if you sanction someone, even report it, it doesn't follow them for the rest of their life. It lets us deal with multiple offenses in your course, additionally elsewhere. So do that. If you don't have an institutional policy, train your people about how you want them to handle it. I know that psychology and CDFS have set policies they put in their syllabi. First offense is a grade reduction. Second offense is failure of the course. If we catch you in our program, third time, you're out of the program. Those kinds of just graduated steps that you want to take, again, are up to you, but I would put them somewhere if you want to have graduated steps so that it's easy to enforce. If it's in a syllabus somewhere or on a department webpage somewhere, you'll win. Because we can point back and be like, you were told, right? This is number 2, you lose. So if you want to have those things, think about putting some there and be transparent to students. Be consistent. We're revising the academic integrity policy. This is one I just revise every year because I have nothing better to do. Current definition is hard to follow if you're not a student, but I think it's also pretty standard. I don't want to read it, so I'm not going to. I think more importantly here, and I'm going to pitch this over again to Sarah and Tom, is to define it in terms of your program and course, right? This is the institution, so the lawyers can win when they get litigated against the student who got kicked out for plagiarizing 5 times. You'd be like, no, we define it. This is why we lose. But for you, it's different, right? For you, it may mean you didn't follow format correctly, or you paraphrased too much, or whatever. And disciplinary standards are different, and even course standards are different, and instructor standards are different. Too much of that discrepancy causes a problem. Just tell your students what it means to you. There are all kinds of things that different people worry about. Improper collaboration. Some disciplines let their students write together and produce one thing. If that's okay, tell them it's okay. If it's not okay, a student may have just taken a class where that was okay. Tell them that's not okay, right? It has to be fully your thing. I have to be able to grade you for your thing. I assume contract cheating is always bad, but there are some disciplines that I would argue with, but you have the right to say improper citation can be treated as plagiarism. If you're going to treat it that way, tell someone that you're going to treat improper citation that way so that they at least know to pay more attention to their citation practices. They may have just had someone who's like, throw quotes around it, it's fine, right? Like, if that's not going to be the case, again, let them know that's not the case. Put it in your syllabi, and then be consistent. Part of what we also see that gets particularly faculty in trouble is where you'll nail one student to the wall for one thing and see the exact same thing for student B and be like, well, student B is amazing. They're an A student. I love student B. I'm not punishing student B. Don't do that. That doesn't end well for anyone. Defining it?
What you said kind of corresponds to a lot of what I've seen in the academic literature from composition, which is that we have a desire to just have it absolute and finite, and it's the same in every context, but that's not real. What constitutes academic dishonesty or what constitutes plagiarism is actually going to vary from context to context in some way, shape, or form, right? Even in labs, you might be collaborating on a piece of writing or basically filling in the blanks of what is largely a boilerplate, report. And then in English, it's going to be different where and we always say like originality, it has to be original. It's like, what does that mean? I have to like poke a badger with a spoon? Like what? Like I have to come up with something new that's never been said before. And it's really kind of intimidating, right? And so one of the things that the research says is that we need to teach it contextually. We need to teach in each of our various disciplines. We need to talk about frankly and honestly, kind of what the conventions of that discipline are, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, and so it's one of the issues that I especially encounter is if somebody plagiarizes an advanced course, they're like, well, didn't you cover this in 101? Like, well, yeah, we did. Then that was 3 years ago, and maybe it was like a couple days. And it was a completely different context and genre than what you're asking for in your class. And so you kind of have to take some of that responsibility on in other contexts to actually teach the students in this context, in this discipline, this is what's acceptable, this is what's not acceptable. This is what requires acknowledgement, this is what does not require acknowledgement. And do that for your class. You can't just assume like, oh, this has been covered already, they should already know this. If that was the case, like I'd be out of a job because they should already know grammar by the time they get to me. They should already know how to research by the time they get to me. They should already know how to write a paragraph by the time they get. But we're working on it every day. So.
Yeah, so in engineering, we have a lot of people from different backgrounds and different cultures, and you can't assume that everyone has the same definitions of plagiarism or teamwork. So we have put into our first course in the program mandatory plagiarism avoidance modules that we worked with the library on. So all of our students go through plagiarism avoidance tutorials and then take an assessment on it. So then we have an assessment for each student. That way if they come back later and they say, but I didn't understand that was plagiarism, you're like, well, you took this test on it, you answered it correctly, so you did at some point. And then we also have one day where the librarians actually come in and give a lecture to our students about proper resources. So what is a good resource when you're writing an engineering technical report, like not Wikipedia, but a journal, how to find those journals, how to appropriately cite those journals, what's appropriate paraphrasing, quoting, how to appropriately cite in the MLA format or APA format that we request. So it's actually part of our course and for our first engineering course. So that's how we start them, and that's usually the second or third week of the semester. So we try to inform them and make it part of our curriculum.
And those are really good modules. I'm kind of arrogant in thinking like, well, nobody can teach plagiarism better than us, and then I kind of had to revise that and say, well, nobody other than the libraries can teach plagiarism better because they're actually very helpful. They've got very clear definitions. They've got activities and examples where they apply that knowledge. So they're really well put together, yeah.
And I have the social graces of a bear, so I'm going to say something I should have said at the very beginning, which is interrupt us. We're informal, ask questions. I'm glad I did introductions. That's why I actually put it on the slides so that I remember. I usually just like, let's go! Who are these people? We don't know! Who cares?
My name's Melissa, by the way. You called me Sarah a minute ago. I was just going to roll with it.
Oh, yeah.
I was just going to go with it.
I know that's not your name, but I like
I
that.
don't care. It's good.
It's
You
fine.
look like a Sarah. You're fine.
I'll be Sarah today.
This is now more
Okay.
them than me. How will you catch stuff?
So, you want to go? Okay. So I like to be very upfront with my students on the first day. I let them know I'm aware that Chegg exists. Are you familiar with Chegg? So it's like $14.95 a month, and basically they can get any solution manual they want. And if I come up with a unique assignment within 24 to 48 hours, the solution is posted for them. I teach a computer programming class, so I continually come up with new projects, and these solutions, again, will be on Chegg within 48 hours. So I let the students know, hey, I can pay $14.95 a month too. I have a Chegg account. Don't go there, right? Do your own work. I let them know in advance all of their written work will be turned in through Turnitin, so they're aware that it's going into that repository. And I try to be transparent. I tell them, stories up front. I unfortunately had a group of, I think, 12 honor students a couple years ago I had to turn in for academic dishonesty, so it can be anyone. I tell them, it's not you're an honor student or you're this, you're that. It can happen to anyone. So if you have a question about it, come see me before you just turn something in that you're not sure about.
This is the part where I say, and this may come as a surprise to folks, but in undergraduate writing, we do not require our instructors to use Turnitin. They have access to it. They can use it if they want to, but for an array of reasons, which I can talk about if you're interested, but we don't require Turnitin. The ways that we catch them are simply through process work. So we kind of have them do steps as they're progressing through the course. And so it's pretty obvious, when the night before a paper's due and a student said, wow, I see you suddenly changed your topic to this entirely different thing. Or something like, wow, what an interesting choice to switch from Times New Roman to Helvetica at this moment in your paper. So a lot of the stuff that we encounter, it's not that sophisticated. And we've been working with the writing so much that typically even from we do writing on day one of the course, we can kind of see in week 3, like, wow, wait a minute, you have either made some amazing advances in your writing, or this isn't yours. And then we'll address it various ways. There's always just searching through Google. We do have access to Turnitin, so that's another tool we can use if we want to or need to. But oftentimes we don't even need to do that. We can just kind of see it. And then the other thing that I try to coach our instructors to think about is like, okay, maybe you can tell something is off, like alarm bells are going off. This just doesn't seem like the student's writing. But maybe you don't have that hard evidence of, it comes from this particular website, it was posted 2 years ago, so on and so forth. What I try to coach our instructors to do is be able to and willing to talk to students about ethos as credibility, right? And so if you have alarm bells going off in your head saying this isn't the student's work, you want to be able to articulate why you feel that way. And that's actually a sign of not successful writing. If suddenly you've got issues with the student's credibility, like, well, wait a minute, this doesn't sound like you, or how did you kind of take this step here, or where did you get this information from? Because you seem to be treating it as common knowledge when it's not common knowledge. But being able to talk to students about ethos and credibility as red flags, like here's the reasons that this makes me skeptical that this is your work. And you're not writing them up, you're not threatening them in any way, but you're talking about basically that document or that thing they're producing is a rhetorical construction, right? Like, and it relies on the honesty and integrity of the author. And so being able to talk to them about those issues and saying, here are the things that are raise red flags for me that we really have to think about and talk about, you can still turn that into a teaching moment without like being maybe overcome by the need to just like what we might call gotcha plagiarism, right? Suddenly your job becomes just policing as opposed to teaching. And that's one of the things we try to resist too in the undergraduate writing courses, is that gotcha plagiarism.
And I would add just, if you use one of those things, learn how to use them. Turnitin is, I would say, a bit of an art as opposed to a science. Right. We'll see reports of like, hey, I got 7% hit back fail. And you're like, well, let me tell you why you probably don't want to make that jump, right? Yeah. ITS has actually a really nice guide for us here at WVU on how to use Turnitin. I would avail yourselves of that. If you have questions, there are departments who use it well. I'm happy to connect you with those departments. But if you've got anything you're doing, again, do it intentionally, do it and transparently, and educate across your entire department, so everyone's doing it the same. The legal team, who I deal with more than I care to, is always concerned about one person doing it one way within a department in particular, and then one person doing it another way, or the same person doing it two different ways. Again, I don't want to tell you, do this, use this, don't use this. Whatever you do it intentionally, do it transparently, talk to your students, tell them what you're going to do, and know what you're doing, and be consistent about it. This is the assessment guide piece. One thing I find troubling, and it's around plagiarism often, is that the learning outcomes for a course, if you're an assessment person, if we don't get to learning outcomes in a presentation, something's gone horribly wrong, right? Why do they care so much about learning outcomes? Well, this is what you're supposed to teach, right? This is the stuff that their students are doing. This is what they're supposed to learn. And if a student is plagiarizing in a course where there was no writing outcome, I start wondering why they were writing, right? How did that assessment align with your outcomes? So this is a course one outcomes. Whose course is this?
Is it me?
That's
I
you.
think so.
Oh, yeah. Well, yes, of course it is. These look very familiar.
And know your outcomes. But I mean, if you look at this was English 101, I think, Tom?
Yeah.
I think I stole it from 101. Is there writing in these outcomes? Do you see that they would be writing? That plagiarism would be something?
I see the word.
Yeah.
I see the word.
Not only the word, but you can just see other things where an assessment is going to make sense that it is writing heavy, right? Where I can see, like, even the ones that don't have write in it, I'm like, well, clearly this is a writing heavy course, right? Do you want to speak to your outcomes?
One of basically our primary measure for a lot of this stuff is kind of a holistic assessment of a portfolio at the end of the course, right? And the idea is that we're essentially grading them on what they know at the end instead of what they don't know at the beginning. So when students are completing projects, they'll turn in a project, they'll get feedback from the instructor as opposed to a letter grade. And then they have basically all semester to revise and edit and polish their final portfolios so that they have a chance to kind of develop as they go. And especially we've also basically got, most of our courses are taught by new and developing teachers, right? So they're kind of learning along with the students. And so this is very process oriented and I would say kind of flexible way for both the instructor and the student to kind of grow and develop their knowledge. And what we know from decades of research on writing, as well as our own local assessment reports, is that the course does what it's supposed to do in the sense that it moves the needle, like it advances students' writing knowledge, it advances students' writing skills, but the notion that any individual course is going to just churn out a fully mature and effective and versatile writer who needs no further instruction, it's not the case. Like what we know in terms of advancing writing skills and knowledge is it takes time and practice, right? So thankfully we have two courses. Hopefully they're encountering writing in other contexts. But we get 101 done most likely in the first year. Sometimes they don't take 102 until the last semester of their senior year, unfortunately. And if they go from year 1 to year 4 without encountering writing in any other context, they forget it's not like riding a bike. It is something that takes continued effort, continued practice, and like I said, this is a process-based approach, so we break it down into smaller steps. We're building the projects all the way through the course instead of just giving them a project sheet and saying, see you in 3 weeks, and then we see that finished product. Like, we're trying to build it with them that whole time, so we have a really good sense of what they're developing, how it's developing, and that sort of thing through those smaller projects. So it's not just like, here's the project, and then we don't talk about it, we don't work on it, we don't see it until they turn it in. That's another way that you can kind of breed like academic integrity or plagiarism issues, is if there's no kind of check-in, it's just kind of, okay, just turn it in when it's done sort of thing. And I also think the fact that they can revise, they can edit, and they have the chance to kind of develop it as opposed to it being a high-stakes assessment the first time they turn it in for a grade, that also helps to kind of reduce some of the concern about plagiarism, because they know, in some sense, like, yes, you can do it wrong and you have a chance to fix it, as opposed to nope, if you do it wrong, throwing the book at you, you're going to get in trouble, right? And which raises the stakes and raises the anxiety about doing it and doing it right.
And the reason I love these outcomes is it's got reflection on an assessment of their own writing in there, so that they have the chance to learn these things. It also has collaboration and what those collaborative opportunities are. It's not collaborate in writing, but in giving and receiving feedback. So again, they know what the appropriate collaborative structures are, and they're part of the course outcomes. Mm-hmm. The students, if you go over these things to your students, they should know what they're doing. Mm-hmm. And these then are the course one writing assignments. Based on those outcomes, as what Tom just said, this is what they do in that course, right? Do they align? People like me, again, are looking for that alignment. Does what you say you teach align with the kinds of assessments you're measuring? And when you go back and look at all that writing stuff, like Tom talked about, and what they're doing, does that make sense? Yeah, right? And again, the students are going to understand why they're being assessed, why it matters, which also reduces grade anxiety. Part of what drives academic dishonesty is a student getting an assignment, they're like, I don't know why this assignment matters, right? Yeah. If it's tied to outcomes, if it's tied to what you're doing in the course, it's much less likely to generate cheating. Mm-hmm. Course 2 has a lot of outcomes, and this was engineering.
Engineering 102.
102.
Yeah. So we focus on technical writing and technical communication in this course. They take this course after they take the course where they learn about plagiarism, technical writing. So we talk to the engineers about, you can design the most awesome thing ever, but if you can't communicate it, then it's pretty well worthless. And we know engineers need a lot of help, me included, with communication and how to write effectively. So we keep it as a learning objective throughout their first year. So this focuses mostly on technical report writing technical posters, and also writing computer programming, because they may not realize initially, but computer programming can be plagiarized as well. So if you go online and you copy and paste a part of someone's code, that's plagiarism. And it's pretty easy to find plagiarism of coding, because coding is basically just like writing. Everybody has their own style. So we make them aware of that as well.
These are also great outcomes. Why I wanted to include this one and why it's so great to have someone from engineering here is we don't think of engineering as the writing people, right? We think people like Tom, clearly, writing people. Engineering, and you look at the outcomes, and again, I love these outcomes. From an outcome standpoint, they're written well. They align well with the assessments, right? And she was just talking about the kind of thing they produce. When you think about the kind of thing they produce and you go back to the outcomes, I asked Melissa to highlight those outcomes now that really are the writing outcomes. And you can see, again, they're here. And the students would know why these matter and what specific aspects of the course are subject to plagiarism and why that counts. We harp on outcomes a lot. We harp on assessments a lot. But when they align, they tend to reduce either A, confusion about what plagiarism is, or B, the plagiarism itself. You're never going to get past plagiarism. We'll never get past cheating. But part of driving it down eventually will be educating students and faculty better on all of these things that will drive it down. So I'm always happy to see good course outcomes and good course assessments and alignment and people being transparent and talking to students about it. We shift gears, so I'm going to pause for a second. We go from kind of, hey, this is plagiarism, this is all the stuff like assessments, policies, data, to now kind of proactive ways to reduce it. Some of it's mine, some of it's theirs. So one of my this is my favorite thing in the world. I was a writing instructor. I'm half English, half neuroscience, but I got trained by a lot of the same people actually that trained Tom. And one of my favorite things that I picked up was that topics matter when you give a writing assignment. It doesn't matter if you're English or engineering or what have you. If you give a weak topic, you're inviting plagiarism. If you say, hey, write me a paper on legalizing marijuana, and you Google that, it's like 9 million hits. I don't even have to work to find something, right? That's a super weak topic. When you get down to that bottom, the super strong topic, it's all this stuff together. It's a topic, plus a genre, plus a perspective, plus a learning outcome, plus a personal response, plus a cross-course touchstone. One of the things I just dealt with yesterday twice with 2 different departments is, hey, our students won't synthesize in their writing. They won't take those things they've learned early in the semester or other courses in the program or other programs and bring it in. Do you ask them to? And every time I ask that, everybody goes, no, we don't. All right, problem solved. I'll take my check and I'll walk home, right? Like, ask them to, right? You've got a topic, and this is one that I actually got from public health. Write a persuasive essay on legalizing marijuana from the perspective of a career path that you identified in Public Health 199 as it would affect inequity and distribution of public health, which is a Public Health 202 learning outcome. If you can find that, so much better off to you, right? Like, at some point, it's kind of like, right? You've got a career in politics, kid. That's harder to plagiarize. Get to a topic, and then it's also easier to change. It seems like it's harder to change, but now change a piece, right? Because then that paper can't be, the whole thing can't fit. Your perspective is different every time you change the perspective. Your genre is different every time you change the genre. You can just swap pieces out every semester and not be repeating the same topic, right? What do you do for topics?
So,
That's actually, I don't know what either of you do for topics.
so I think not only making a complex topic like that, but making a topic that's interesting to the students is what I found helps them not want to plagiarize, because if they think the topic's interesting, they're going to want to learn more about it, they're going to dive in and write about it. So for the computer programming class, I try to come up with unique projects that are something of student interest. So for example, there's a common heat transfer problem where you have like a thin flat plate and you do a nodal analysis of how the temperature gradient's going to change. Nobody wants to sit and program that. That's like super boring. But I was like, okay, cool. This is a matrix, lines and columns. It's a line dance. There's a zombie attack and you have zombie virus that pops up and you have to look at the zombie virus spreading. Same exact code as heat transfer on a thin flat plate, but if you call it zombies, the students are like, oh, this is awesome. It's a zombie apocalypse. I get to write the code for it. It was... I mean, and the tech reports were so much fun.
I bet.
Yeah. So I try to like come up with unique topics that are of something that's current interest to the students, and then they like dive in and get more excited about it and spend less time just trying to Google the solution.
One of the things that we try to do in the undergraduate writing courses is really put the emphasis on the inquiry part instead of the argument. What I mean by that is, every semester I have a handful of folks who are like, can I write about legalizing marijuana? I'm like, well, I normally say, well, what do you want to know about it? They're like, wait, what do you mean? I thought it was just like either you're for it or against it. I'm like, well, and that's part of the problem right there, because their idea of argument, their idea of writing a paper is often, I pick a side and then I defend that side to the death, whether it makes sense or not. And then and part of my process when I'm defending that stance to the death is I go out and I only find the stuff that agrees with me. Oh, look, here's a paper that someone else wrote that agrees with me, and they've said it better than I could say, so I'm just going to take this, maybe change a couple of words to put my style on it, and then turn it in. And that's a bad writing assignment off the bat, right? Where you just pick a side and turn it in on some very broad generic topic like, are you for or against it? So what we try to do is kind of develop the thinking about it and develop the inquiry into the topic. So instead of saying, I want you to prove something to me, because I'm pretty comfortable in my beliefs. I don't need you to prove something to me. But what I want to know is basically like, how are you learning about something? What are you learning about something to build your expertise about it? And so what I've done to kind of help with this is, I'll teach a generic kind of structure in terms of, okay, here's an introduction. What do you do in an introduction? Then what background does your reader need to know in order to understand the topic? And then the thing that I've started doing that baffles them, it's really hard for them to understand, which in my mind is evidence that it's working, because it pushes them beyond what they're comfortable with. I have them write a methods section. In other words, I have them in the background. I need them to say, what sort of question are you asking? What topic do you need to know about and why? And then I ask them to write a methods section and say, how are you finding answers to this question? And then after the methods section, I ask them to write an outcomes section, like, what did you learn by applying these methods? And they're totally confused. They're like, what am I supposed to put in the methods section? Like, I want you to explain how you found the information that you're using in your paper. And they're like, so you want me to write, I Googled legalizing marijuana. I said, yes, because if that's the only thing in your methods section, it's very clear to me we have more work to do. Right? If they cannot elaborate on how they found information and articulate the databases they've used, articulate the methods they used to find the answer to their question, And that's what I would put the emphasis on. Instead of saying, here's a topic like legalizing marijuana, I would start them with a question. What's the question that you're trying to answer? Because it's not like legalizing marijuana isn't a question. Like, in what context should we legalize marijuana? Is legalizing marijuana going to be the economic boon that everybody thinks it's going to be? You know, these are questions that we need answers to, and they're questions that they don't have answers to. They're like, well, I'd have to look that up. We're on to something, right? But that method section is actually like, and we'll talk about the difference between like finding tertiary, secondary, primary sources. We'll also talk about how to do primary research. Like, what would change if you did a survey? Like, who could you survey? One of the best examples of this that I just love is a student in a 102 class was really interested in fashion. So she was doing a research project on fashion, and she said, I really think that if people knew that their clothes came from sweatshops, they would change their shopping habits. And I said, that's great. So here's what we're going to do. We don't have to be a statistician. We don't have to do any like broad, elaborate thing, but just survey your classmates. Ask them that question. If they knew their clothes were coming from sweatshops, would they change their shopping practices? So she did it. We just did a small survey in class, primary research, very introductory, accessible kind of first step to doing research. Totally original to her paper too, right? Like nobody else has done this. She's done this. And like 20 out of 20 people said that they would not change their shopping habits. And she was terrified. She's like, what do I do? I now have evidence that my thesis is not correct. I said, you might have to change your thesis. What is this? You didn't prove anything, but what does this suggest? Well, it suggests that it's not a problem of awareness, and it might be something else. That's a good research outcome. I can do that? Yeah. And she did. So she changed her topic, and she had evidence to suggest that it wasn't a problem with awareness, right? And then that was an original paper because she wasn't just relying on secondary and tertiary sources, but she was doing something that could only be done in her project, right? And that's another way to get to that originality thing that seems so elusive when you're writing about a generic topic, okay?
These are your topics.
Those are both of ours. We have 2 comments.
Yeah, I know.
All right. So I think that it's also important to make sure you're giving them an achievable topic or an achievable project. So if it's too difficult or they don't think that they are going to be able to actually accomplish it, then they'll panic and try to cheat. So I think whether you need to break it down into smaller achievable objectives or just make the overarching project able to be digested and understood more easily by the students, it's helpful. In avoiding them just to go out and Google things. Also, I think it's important to come up with new and unique projects every semester, because if you're making it too easy for them to find solutions and find other work, at least for us with computer programming, then you're kind of assisting in their plagiarism. I mean, as an instructor, if you're not coming up with new and exciting projects all the time, you're kind of failing at your job, in my opinion. So I try to come up with new topics every semester.
I guess for my column, I want to use another anecdote because I think it's illustrative of what I'm talking about here. After class yesterday, a non-traditional student came up to me and said she was really struggling with what to do her research on because again, a lot of times students approach this with this idea that they should already know what the outcome's going to be. They should already know what the end game is, and if they don't, they freak out. And they find somebody else who does, and they just use that, right? And so she'd been working with a topic of family, like just family, because it's an interest to her, right? And one of the avenues we talked about for thinking about family is the foster care crisis in West Virginia. That's just, from all accounts, is just like the number of children in foster care has exploded in the state, and it's largely tied to like the opioid crisis, right? But she started to say like, well, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't know what you want, like, because like I have the outcome already planned out too. Like I know what it's supposed to be. She's like, and I could tell like she was getting upset. Like this is new to her. This is different. Even though I've done it for years now, and I can already see what generally I know how this process goes. I could see tears forming in her eyes. She's like, I don't know what I'm supposed to say about family. I don't even know why. like, I feel family is important, but I don't know how to explain that family is important. And so I told her to come talk to me because I think we could sort this out. But that right there is the research question, right? So all this stuff suggests family is important, but why is family important? And we can start with, connecting it to her experiential knowledge and validating what she does already know, regardless of whether she has sources or not, to say, well, why do you think family is important? What would you say? What are your reasons? Because you're allowed to have your reasons. Then you can find evidence to support your reasons, but it's not like you can't have a thought until you find it in a source, right? And that's a disconnect for students because they kind of think, I'm not allowed to have this thought, or I'm not allowed to say what I think unless I've got a source that already says it first. And so we want to kind of back that up and let them have those thoughts and let them kind of articulate that, and then talk about using sources to support that instead of replace that. Because that's the other thing that I see students do all the time. Instead of writing a topic sentence, they start with a quote, or they start with a source, and they're like, this is what this person says, this is what this person says. They really struggle to see them having something to say as having value, right? And that's the other reason that they freak out and plagiarize, because they don't feel like what they have to say has any value, because they're not experts, they haven't been doing this a long time, and they struggle to actually say, even, again, going back to ethos, even if they're studying in a certain discipline, that gives them an ethos that in that discipline that people outside of that discipline don't have. Does that make sense? So they can start to establish their ethos and talk about why they have credibility on a topic and that their ideas matter. And if their ideas matter and they know that their ideas matter, they're less likely to go back to, I have to find somebody else's ideas because mine aren't any good. If that makes sense. So that's why we want to connect it to their own experiential knowledge, engage in primary or original research, something that they are doing, that they have ownership of, and then having diverse topics, purposes, questions. Okay? Always come back to what's the question that you're trying to answer, instead of just spitting out, regurgitating information on a topic.
As assessment guy, I want to hit on the achievable projects and the new and unique projects again, because I just saw these this semester. I saw 2 courses where they had a lot of plagiarism on final papers, and when we then sat down with the department to look at their achievable projects in a survey course, all their learning outcomes for this 200-level survey course were introduce, understand, very low level. I'm like, these are okay, but they're low level. Produce 25-page research paper at the end of the semester, and you're like, wait, why? What are you doing? Do they get any feedback? No. How much is it worth of their grade? 60%? Why? What do you think is going to happen? Right? No, don't do that. Make it achievable and relevant to the outcomes and level of the course and level of the learning, right? They only can do what they can do at that point in the course that you have taught them, right? Right. And then new and unique projects. The other one that I'm dealing with right now has had a course that has had 200 violations of academic integrity in the last 2 years. So high achiever. And we've just started to work with that department, and when we asked them when the last time they changed their assignments, they said 2003. And I said, so we have a problem there, right? It's new. A year old is old in the information literacy era. 15 years old is as good as a fossil, right? You don't have to update everything all year, every semester. If you're like, I can't remember when I updated this last, you probably are inviting problems, right? And it doesn't have to be a full overhaul. Change something, tweak something, update it with the new content, with a new topic, with a new approach that Melissa or Tom have talked about. And I don't have to come visit you. This is something that both of you have alluded to already. Scaffold the assignment, break it into pieces, make it a process, grade those pieces, and don't let them skip stages. And I'm sure both of them will tell you why. But if they skip stages, you've invited a situation where they will have cheated because they've let something go, they didn't do it, and now stage 3 is due, and it's too late, and they have to rush and change. Mm-hmm. When I talk about scaffolding with people, I did this maybe a couple years ago. There was someone who had 16 steps for a project, and everybody was, I think it was in Statler, actually, now that I say that. And everybody in the room was like, I'm not doing 16 steps. It's like, fine, that's fine. Don't. Do 3, where you have 5 pieces for each third. Like, there's all kinds of different ways to group and scaffold things. There's an entire body of research on scaffolding. I'm not an expert. But if you ever want to get into scaffolding, think about the pieces that are important and breaking and grouping those up. I think I know you for sure. Do you scaffold? Yeah, see, I'll let you both talk about then how you actually scaffold and how it works for you.
Okay, I think, is there a slide about that? I think.
Is there?
Okay. Would you like
Put
to
this
go?
together.
No,
You have better
Amazing.
stories. I'm just going to sit here and listen to your stories. So all the projects that we assign in our fundamentals classes, the very first thing we make them do is a Gantt chart. So they have to plan out from day 1 to the end of the final version of their tech report what they're going to work on when. So we give them all the milestone due dates, and then they have to plan with their peers that they're working with when they're going to work on those projects. So that helps to get them to plan ahead and not wait to the last minute and actually write down when all those intermediate due dates are. And then, so their technical report is made up of a cover page and abstract, background research, introduction, problem statement, methodology, data, results, discussion, conclusions, references. So we make them turn in pieces of that. So the introduction and background is due first. So we go ahead and check their background research, make sure they haven't plagiarized that, make sure they have legitimate sources, and give them feedback on that. And then they turn in data from their testing. So you can plagiarize your data or just blatantly make up your data. So there's lots of times students don't make, so their design projects. So they have to build something, test it, get the data from it, and make conclusions from that. So I can't tell you how many times somebody's just made up their data. And you're like, oh, well, that's weird. You violated the second law of thermodynamics. Could you tell me how you got the temperature of this to cool lower than the temperature of the room?
What an amazing finding.
Right, what an amazing finding. You violated gravity.
Congratulations.
Please explain this to me. So we check their data and then give them feedback on that. And then in my course, I always have them bring a full draft, and I have a class period where I dedicate to a peer review, where they swap them and they read each other's and give each other feedback. And then the final version is due to the instructor. And then I give them feedback. And I make a conscious effort to read and write specific feedback on every document or assignment that my students turn in. I've actually had several students be like, what, you read all that? I'm like, yeah, I made you do it. Like, why would I not read it? And that helps because if they know you're going to read everything and you care about what they're doing, then they're going to put more effort into that. Right. And we also provide the rubrics for each of the items in advance, so the students know what's expected of them. So the rubrics are transparent, they're on eCampus, they can look at them in advance of starting the process.
We try to scaffold both the undergraduate writing courses. I think the best example is 102, where the projects are basically like an annotated bibliography, an evaluation of one of the sources on the annotated bibliography, where they're actually writing a paper about how credible the source is, a proposal, and then a research project with some small element of primary research, and then we have an editorial at the end of the course. It used to be that the editorial was at the beginning of the course, and we kind of realized, like, we're getting really bad editorials because it's it's like Lou, ignorance with confidence. No, I'm kidding, I'm teasing. I'm teasing, right? Yes! but we realized, like, well, they know that they're supposed to sound like they know what they're talking about, even if they don't know what they're talking about. And so what we did was we actually kind of moved the editorial to the end of the course, and then we used all those other projects to build their expertise, so they're reading and they're writing about a subject before they articulate their opinion about what's most important about it. So all of it kind of builds to that editorial where they can finally say, all right, now that I have some knowledge on this is what I think I need to say, right? And then along the way, we're doing smaller kind of low stakes activities. So, and I'm happy to kind of, if anybody wants to talk about how to break stuff down into smaller writing activities, I'm more than happy to talk with you after the session or individually or about your course or your project or whatever. But we do things like free writing, which is essentially the idea of like, okay, there's 2 rules for free writing, which is don't stop writing and don't worry about grammar and punctuation. I know it seems counterintuitive, but trust me, it works to just kind of get ideas down on the page, because we censor ourselves a lot of times because we're worried about, does this sound right? Because we think it's supposed to sound good the first time it comes out. It doesn't sound good for anybody the first time it comes out. So just get it down, get those ideas down, and then that's raw material that then you can work with and mold and shape and revise and edit. So we'll do free writing. We'll also do things like source maps, right, where it's basically a spreadsheet in an English class, where we've got like sources listed down one side, and then we've got topics listed across the top, and then we're kind of matching up sources to topics so we know, okay, that paragraph that's on this particular question or idea has these 3 sources. Those are the ones that I need to put in there. And again, that's process work. It's something you can hold them accountable for, but it's also, all of that stuff is not just busy work, it's geared towards producing a better writing project. And if you're checking in and you're looking at it along the way, you can see that someone is doing the work, or you can see that someone is not doing the work. And then if you've got all this stuff that the student has done prior to that project, and then they say the night before, I don't like my project or my topic anymore, I'm going to change it. Immediately you can talk about, that's a bad choice, I think. It's your choice, maybe, depending on how crafty you want to be with it. I tend to put everything in the student's responsibility. It's their choice what they do. It's their writing. But I'm like, here's the trouble spot. And I don't know if you've followed like the speak right language, the purpose, audience, conventions, trouble spots. I talk to them about it as a trouble spot. It's like, here's the trouble spot. You've been building your ethos and your credibility with this project for the last 2 weeks, and now the night before you're switching to something else. What am I to think as your instructor about the credibility of what you're going to turn into me next if it totally deviates from the established ethos that you've created? And so I'm basically telling them, I know what you're doing, and it's not going to work well for you. And then they're like, well, maybe I'll stick with it then. Okay, I think that might be a good choice. That might be a strong choice you've made, right? But breaking it down into those smaller steps that are not just busy work, but process work that's meant to help them develop their thinking, develop their practices, and develop what's going to be in that project, whether it's a free write or a source map or even like the other thing I've done, if we've got 3 weeks for a project, at the end of week 1, I'm saying, give me 300 words of that project, any 300 words. 300 words is about 1 page in my thinking, right? So it can be the beginning, it could be the end, it could be a little bit of the beginning, middle, and the end. But I want to see 300 words just so I can see the progress that you're making, right? So that you're putting in steps that are gonna necessitate action on their part. Toward that goal, instead of just like, all right, see you in 3 weeks, and that project's due, and they're going to do it all the night before, and they're going to panic, and they're going to, I got to get this done, I'm going to copy some stuff, and cross my fingers, like that's the writing process that we want to avoid.
My idealized assessment guide perspective is always only assign what you can give feedback on. Mm-hmm. It's sometimes a change in perspective where we like to assign a ton of stuff, give a grade, but we don't want to give the feedback for all that stuff because it's super tough to give feedback on all that stuff. Mm-hmm. But really, students learn from the feedback more than they do the grade. The grade just tells them how well they did, but not mm-hmm. what they need to do better or learn differently. If feedback is the mode to learning, then really limit yourself on assessments to what you can give feedback on. Mm-hmm. They also learn to value what you give feedback on, exactly like Melissa said. And so if you don't give feedback on it, tends to tell them you don't care, you're not paying attention, and then all of a sudden, when it comes time to do that, you've never paid attention all semester. Why do I think you're paying attention now? I'm going to cheat, right? Mm-hmm. You haven't said anything to me. But again, it won't short-circuit everything, but ideally it does help.
And if I could just add to that too, I would suggest, and I'm happy for your input on this too, but like when we talk about feedback, I think the default that I go to is like, okay, I have to sit at my desk and I have to respond to all 44 of these with a personal note, and that already I'm like, ugh, that's overwhelming, and I've got a bunch of other stuff to do. But I think there are other kind of creative ways to hold people accountable and to provide some of that feedback. Mm-hmm. So it might not be like grading each and every assignment, especially if it's meant to be a low-stakes mm-hmm. assignment, but you can collect them, you can read them, you can synthesize them, and then you can work with them in the classroom, right? So you can have an activity, like a follow-up activity where students are working in groups and reporting out to each other as a kind of peer review or feedback or continued work with that thing. And if they're like, well, I don't have mine, okay, all I'm doing is putting a note in my book that says the person didn't complete that part of the process work. It's going to count towards their participation. So you can do this where you're kind of, in some maybe sense, kind of crowdsourcing a little bit of the labor or dividing it up instead of just putting it all on you as the instructor, because I know as instructors we have countless demands on our time and energy, and so that's where we start to maybe put in some gaps. But if you find other ways to kind of engage and hold people accountable without putting just like the burden of everything and everyone on you for feedback, I think that there's ways to do that too, creative ways to do that can be engaging and get them working as well. Because as someone, a very wise teacher has told me, like, if you're the one who's working the hardest in the class, then you're doing it wrong, right? You want to have them working hard and you having not all of it on you all the time. Does that make sense? Okay. What do you think?
And it's what I've seen a lot of people with writing projects, and what I've helped a lot of writing project feedback is they want to circle every missed comma, every punctuation mark, every split infinitive, you want to have words everywhere, and at some point, man, you're fried on essay 3, right?
Right.
Kid has a comma problem, circle the first 3. You have a comma problem, find the next 5, right? Like, okay, that's way faster. You still give them now the important feedback, right? The feedback is you have a comma problem, not that you need to see because they ain't going to learn from that either. After I've seen the 15th comma circled, I'm not counting the other 37. Right? I still don't know how to use the damn comma. Right. How do I use a comma? Give them feedback they can do something with, right? And that you want to do with, but that doesn't fry you out either. And that feedback isn't necessarily right. You writing, spilling tons of ink. It is coming back to that assignment and connecting it to the next step and explaining what's important and giving them practice with it and teaching them to learn from it, right? Feedback is, again, feedback. It is, I have taken something, I'm giving it back to you so we can do something with it again, right? That is not only written comments, that is feedback. It is doing something again with it.
I also like to make general comments at the beginning of a class. So if I'm passing it back an assignment or they've recently turned in an assignment, I like to give some just general affirmations without calling any individuals out. Be like, oh, I was reading these and I really like that someone said X, Y, and Z, or I thought it was really great that several of you brought up this. So that way the whole class gets a general idea that I am reading and I'm carrying and I'm finding them interesting, even if I didn't necessarily read someone's entire specific document.
That's good feedback practices in general. Writing is its own, all feedback is task dependent, right? If you're sitting in a car taking your driving lessons, you do not want a driving instructor sitting next to you waiting till you hit the car in front of you be like, hey, you should have stopped, right? The feedback needs to be instantaneous with motoric tasks. It's the same thing if you've ever played any sport. You don't wait till the kid has learned the muscle memory and be like, all season I'd let you do that. You really shouldn't have been doing that all season, right? Too late. You've lost the opportunity. Writing has its, since we're talking about plagiarism, writing has its own kind of window of effectiveness. They need to practice on their own. They need to go home and revise and do the process. But they also need then to receive instructor feedback on how you have been doing that. Depending on the kind of thing they're writing, it's still going to be different, right? An essay paper, that's why I like scaffolding. It gives you the opportunity to find when you want to give them that feedback and start then actually targeting it. But it might be different for code than it is for an essay paper. It's probably different than a 100 level class than it is a 400 level capstone, right? What is unequivocal from all learning science research is after 2 weeks, they've already forgotten what you could have connected it to, and which is why I say don't assign what you can't give feedback on, right? The idea is I got to turn this around quickly. Whatever that quickly means, at some point you've lost your window. I know I've got a professor I like a lot who labors over a ton of feedback and gives everything all back at the end of the semester, everything all semester, and I'm like, I think you want to rethink that, right? Like doing a ton of work, but it isn't helping. The student has lost the opportunity to actually apply the feedback you've labored over to do anything with it, improve their learning. Why, if you're going to give feedback, again, give it in the window where it can actually help the student do something with.
And one of the pieces of research that I have found liberating, especially for responding to writing, because there are so many issues that you can respond to in a student writing, from purpose to audience to conventions to line edits and that sort of thing. It's from Nancy Summers in a book, Responding to Student Writing, and she says, well, you don't teach your whole class in one day, right? Right? You teach it one lesson at a time. So when you're responding to student writing, you might have a rubric that gives them maybe a general sense of the criteria and the things that need to work on. But then if you're going to write a comment, try to teach one lesson. Because if you teach all the lessons at once, what students learn is that they're not good at this. And it can be demoralizing, right? But if you put some parameters on it and say, all right, with this paper, with this draft, or with this piece, I want to teach one lesson. And you decide what that lesson is, and then you just focus your comment on, here's the thing you need to work on for next time. It can be much more productive, and it actually, from an instructor standpoint, I was like, oh my gosh, like if I can just teach one lesson, like I can actually get these done. Right? I can move a little more efficiently, and I get better at explaining that one lesson that I'm trying to teach too. So it's actually kind of helped me instead of like trying to do it all at once, just diagnosing, all right, what's the thing that we need to focus on first? And let's do that one thing, let's improve that one thing, knowing that next time I can focus on a different lesson with this student or with these students. So focus on teaching one lesson. I think that's a good general rule for putting some constraints on the time that you put into feedback and that sort of thing, responding.
I like that a lot. I'm going to steal that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Done. Just stole it. Okay.
There we go.
I'm not even quote Summers. It's a plagiarism thing. I'm going to just
right.
say it's my thing.
Acknowledge your sources. Yeah. The great Lou Slimak.
I said this one time.
All right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, see.
Yeah. It's not inaccurate.
And here's your course feedback. I don't know if there's anything
That
specific.
kind of already talked about
Yeah.
that.
Okay. Slightly different kind of feedback is the one-to-one feedback prior to the due date. So you get feedback on finished projects or even things that they've turned in, right? Ongoing feedback, as again, process feedback, I think you can separate from assessment or grading feedback, where you want them to, I'm gonna evaluate you now. Here's what you want. Here's what you need to work on, right? There's also just feedback that is ongoing. Hey, how you doing? What's going on? Where are you at in this process? I'm not assessing you. I'm not grading you, but I can see where you're at. And it doesn't even have to be you. The nice thing about an institution this size is there are tutoring labs, there are writing centers, there are all kinds of other opportunities to go out and have someone sit down with a student and say, hey, how you doing with this? Because a lot of times they may tell someone else something they wouldn't tell you. I can remember having friends in Purdue work in the writing lab and had seen drafts from other courses where they're like, this is plagiarized. You don't want to turn this in, right? We're not, and I don't have to say anything. Don't do this. This is bad. But if they're encouraged to do that, they can have someone else who's not you head them off. It also just reduces grade anxiety, right? The more someone has looked at something of yours, if you're freaking out, even if it is scaffolded, you're still eventually worried about that grade. If someone's looked at it and be like, yeah, I think you're heading in the right direction. You, someone else, someone they can trust, it reduces that grade anxiety. It drives down the opportunity to plagiarize. We have lots of those resources. I have another slide that has a ton of list of all the different tutoring labs. You've got things like MindFit here. We have the honors group that has won national awards for their tutoring. We've got class people. I mean, this university has a ton of resources. What I find in my role often is that people don't know about the resources usually in their own college, let alone next door, let alone across town, on Evansdale. If you're on Evansdale at downtown, and it's kind of like, yeah, but all your students use all of those. You may know about them, but your students are wandering between campuses anyways. Go ahead and hook them up with all those resources. So if you've ever got a resource question, throw it my way. I can usually tell you who can, if I can't answer it, I can tell you who can answer it.
In my preparation for today, the other thing I did was I looked at a couple of different kind of examples for activities you could do to kind of teach students about plagiarism. Because one of the things that seems unanimous is the idea that, like, just reading the policy on the first day and never talking about it again is insufficient, right? That's not gonna cover your bases the way we would hope it might. So a couple of activities that I discovered that I think could be really useful that go along with this idea of, like, honesty, and even though we're talking about plagiarism, we're talking about cheating, we're talking about, like, how we catch students or what the sanctions should be. Really what we're talking about is honesty and integrity in work, right? Honesty and integrity in academic work, which is a value of the academic community. And so ways to kind of talk about and teach honesty and integrity as opposed to just punishment for when they get it wrong, I think are really important. So one of the things that you might do is take whatever academic integrity policy you've put on your syllabus, or take it from the student code of conduct, put it on a separate sheet of paper, isolate it, okay, and then strategically put in blank lines, like maybe between the paragraphs or between key points, and just put in space where a student could write. And then read that paragraph and then say, all right, I want you to paraphrase what that paragraph says. Okay, in your own words, explain to me what you just read and what you understand that paragraph to be articulating. So that gets them engaged in writing, it gets them engaged in paraphrasing, and it creates some conversation where they might be like, well, wait a minute. So asking for a friend, what if you... And then you can have some conversation about some, what exactly these policies, which are written from a legal standpoint, actually mean in terms of practice and implementation. So that's one idea that you could use. Another idea is if you're going to do some kind of peer review, you've got a project, and maybe this would even work for like coding or something like that. But the idea is give each student 3 colored pencils. So 3 different colors, right? And then what they do, they trade papers, and then at the top of the paper, they create a key. So this color is for paraphrase, color 2 is for quotation, and color 3 is for the author's own words. And then they go through and they read it maybe once over just to kind of get the general sense of the thing, but then they go through and they color code the language or the sentences in the paper according to paraphrase, quote, or author's own words, so that you've got a visual cue to how much is being is from another source and how much is the author's own words and where that happens. Because like I said before, a lot of times one of the problems I see in student writing is that the sources, the quotes and the paraphrase are often the topic sentences and the lead part of the paragraph, and their own words are maybe a few sentences at the beginning and a few sentences at the end. Right, so, and that's tough to see unless it's color-coded. So those are just 2 activities that you might think about, as well as thinking about this general idea of like, this is something that you want to address throughout the course and throughout your time with the students, instead of just like, okay, we covered that Monday, we're done talking about integrity, we're done talking about honesty. Like that's something we kind of need to keep coming back to all the way through, if we value it, which we say we do.
Yeah, there are programs with program learning outcomes around professionalism, so ethics.
Yeah.
If you're in a health science center, there's all kinds of those. Engineering has them, but the social work has them. If you have a learning outcome at the program level, it says, hey, you're going to learn to communicate professionally. Well, we assume professionals aren't plagiarizing, right? That's not what professional communication is. It helps to connect that throughout the program. And part of what you keep hearing from both Melissa and Tom is that this isn't a one-time deal, right? When we looked at Gen Ed assessment of 101 and 102, it does work. It does move the needle. They learn something. If you think they are at proficiency, then we could stop teaching them everything at the 102 level, right? They're done. They're perfect. No, that's why there are 4 years of these things, right? You repeat these skills. You don't become an engineer or a nurse or anything in the first year. You need to continue practicing them. Tie all that together, right? Communication is professional in different ways. It is always honest, and it is always full of integrity for all of our disciplines. Make that part of what you mean by professional communication and effective communication. It isn't effective, it's plagiarized, right? You have just undermined everything else you said. Even if that was the original message was powerful, you plagiarizing it has undermined the message you have transmitted, right? That is not professional. That is not effective. So again, come back to outcomes. Even at the program level, we care about these things. At the college level, we care about these things. If your accrediting body cares about these things, sometimes it's your professional body, like librarians or other groups. We all care about the same thing. Talk to your students about it. I'm always amazed also how often programs don't talk about what these things mean to students and why it matters. Tell the stories. If you're an engineer and you have continually plagiarized your reports, I don't want you working in my firm. My dad was a head engineer for a long time, and he would get people who plagiarized reports, and he'd be like, I can't trust this kid, right? Like, I can't trust this engineer we hired. I have to fire him, right? It is good for engineers in school. You're like, this is what's going to happen to you in the real world if you do this. It is not good. It does not go well. Connect it back to those things that sometimes seem abstract, Again, the people like me care about and pound on. And you're like, why do you care so much? Because it should matter. It does matter. You care about it for that reason. That's why it's your learning outcome, right? That's why it's your program outcome. It's why it's an accrediting body's outcome. Someone cares about this kind of behavior. Connect it. Make it a thread for them. Make it actually matter and relevant. So the question was how to get students to take first drafts of scaffolded assignments seriously. If you're going to get feedback and you're going to get practice and revision, how do you take that seriously?
Right.
Get them to take that seriously.
Right. I'm thinking because it's tough, and one of the things that we will see in an undergraduate writing course, especially with everything weighted at the end, is what I would call sandbagging. You know, where they're like, well, I'm just going to turn in minimal stuff just to get my points, but I'm really going to knock this out in the last week, right? So I have different ways of trying to address that. One of them is that I'm explicit with them, and again, like I'll tell them a story. I'm like in all the time doing this, like I'm telling you, I've seen that strategy. People are sandbagging, and then they think that last week they're going to knock this portfolio out, but what they're not thinking about right now is that last week they're going to be tired. Last week they're going to have exams, and so I've seen so many people turn in lackluster portfolios because they postponed, they deferred, they kicked the can down the road thinking they were going to have more time later. And I'm just open with them about that. I'm like, it's your call, but again, I think it's a bad call. You know, so I'm trying to be explicit about how this fits into the larger process. I also talk to them about the fact that I can give them better feedback if they give me a better effort, right? So if they turn in something that's unfinished, my first piece of advice is you should finish. Right, like that's my feedback. Is like keep going, but the more they give me, the more I can give them. Right, so those are kind of my two rhetorical kind of pleas, if you will. Right, and for the most part, you know, I think a lot of the students are convinced by that. They at least hear me. Right, but I still encounter that where they're just not taking it seriously. And so the other thing that I can point to that's in these slides is that even though the projects are revisable. And all the way up to that portfolio, we also have a portion of the grade that's set aside for what we would call writing exercises, and that's 20%. And those are basically non-revisable, and they're graded, right, according to a rubric that we have in our textbook. And so on any week that there isn't a project due, we have a writing exercise due. And that writing exercise is graded, A, B, C, D, F, basically. And so it's still process writing, and it's geared toward the project, but it's graded. And so their feedback is going to be, again, I'm going to try to basically use the language of the rubric so that the standards are clear, and I'm reinforcing, like, this is what I expect from the work that you're doing. And then I'm trying to maybe teach them one kind of mini lesson with each piece of that homework. But it's still, they're accountable in the sense that this counts for 20% of their grades, so they need to put forth some effort. It's not just all willy-nilly.
Yeah. I do the same thing. So I tie minimal points to everything that they turn in. So their first draft of everything is worth some points. Mm-hmm. So if they do a very poor job with it, they're going to lose some points. Mm-hmm. And then ultimately I explain to them, same thing. If you give me garbage, I can be like, don't write this badly. Or like if you give me 2 paragraphs and you're supposed to turn in 3 pages, there's not much advice I can give you. So your final product is probably not going to benefit from the advice you would have gotten if you made a solid first attempt. It's the same kind of things.
Yeah, an ideal assessment land, that point distribution is important. Whenever I see high stakes end of course assessments, there's a part of me that flips over and is just freaking out. The more you can distribute it, the more you can tell them and teach them that each piece of the process is worth something, right? You still want it to get more important as it goes on. That's why you want the summative assessments late to be worth more. More is not everything, right? More is more, because they should have learned by the time they got there. But you're also teaching them the value of learning, right? So that draft is a piece of learning. Give it some value, right? And even if it's a small piece of value, you do that a couple times, you have lost a chunk of points you can't get back, right? Give it some value, and unfortunately grades are often the currency of that value.
And what the way I coach our instructors too is that we use holistic assessment, which I find really valuable because it gets away from, and I understand the kind of the point systems that folks use, right? But we want to kind of get away from the minutia kind of like where did I lose my points, and is it did I get 0.5 off for this mistake or 0.75 off? You know, and I'm like, it's not Hufflepuff. Like, it's not
I'm sorry,
Hogwarts.
but that drives me and my engineers crazy.
Yeah. So we have kind of these broad kind of like 10% for participation, 20% for the writing exercises, 70% for the portfolio, and then we grade it. I see it as an evidence-based decision, right? Where I'm looking at all of the evidence that the student has given me. I'm not just tallying all the point deductions, but I'm saying, all right, based on the evidence I have about how well you did on your exercises, how many deadlines you missed or made, you know, and that sort of thing, that gives me, according to our evaluation guidelines, okay, this is a C for participation, this is a B for exercises, and the portfolio is a B, therefore, you know, and the only time I really use the numbers is to make sure that I'm weighting each one of those correctly according to what we say that we're doing. Yeah, sure. So the question is how to address that student pushback when they expect the response or the feedback to essentially be a contract that says, well, if you didn't point it out, then you can't hold me accountable for it, right? Yeah, that's pretty common in the undergraduate writing courses too. I don't know about other contexts. So, you know, that's one reason that I find rubrics really helpful. Because that way, in some sense, if I'm looking for it, it should be on the rubric, right? And that way it's communicated to them. So what I'll do in my feedback for a student is I'll have the rubric, which basically, it's not tied to grades, but it's basically like 3 columns. Like, here's the criteria, and for you, this is a strength, it's okay, or I think I call it like discussion, like it's good enough that we can talk about it, and then there's focus for revision. Right? And so those are the 3 columns that I use for all those criteria. So everybody gets a holistic assessment where I say, so they can see like, oh, I've got these 3 things that are focused for revision. But I'm like, I don't know if you didn't do it because you don't understand or if you just didn't get to it. You know, so if you don't know why these things are focused for revision, you have the opportunity to come see me or ask in class or go to the Speak Right studio. Or, you know, there's lots of ways where they can get the information that they need. It's their responsibility. But I'm also explicit about how I do feedback, too. So I tell them, you're going to get this holistic feedback. It's going to tell you where and what I say is this is meant to help you prioritize your revision, okay? And then I teach that one lesson at the end. I'm like, this is where I want you to start. If you don't know where to go after you do this one thing that I've pointed out, you've got weeks to talk to me. I've got office hours Monday and Wednesday from 2:30 to 3:30. We also meet 3 times a week, which sometimes I'm skeptical they know that based on their attendance record, right? So there's ample opportunities for them to get that clarification. The idea that the feedback is some sort of contract where we have to identify every single thing that they must improve, otherwise they've got us over a barrel, that's not a thing. Mm-mm. Yeah.
I'm not good at the one thing. I am super anal and mark everything, so I have nothing to add.
I went back to the...
Yeah. I circle every instance of first person, every single one of them, every we, I, our, yeah.
I went back to the course 1 outcomes, that's Tom's outcomes, and he's got assess their own writing in there, right? And this is why I love self-assessment as a outcome, regardless if it's your writing or your performance in the class. Your job as an instructor is exactly that, is to help them learn, and you are not there to teach them on their product every single teeny little thing. The outcomes are their responsibility to learn, right? You have told them that. Your feedback is an explicit part of that, and you can tell them, look, I'm going to address the priorities, the things that are major concerns. That is not everything. That is the stuff you need to work on first. You need to learn to assess your own product. Right? One of the skills that we see nationally is in decline is self-assessment. And I would like to see instructors task students explicitly with more self-assessment. What aren't you doing well? Beyond the things that I can point my finger at, right? There should be several other things that you can say, oh yeah, I'm not doing that well. Well, then work on it. Then let us work on it together, right? Take that next step yourself. Make it an outcome. Teach them to self-assess.
Right. And that's like, and to be honest, like, with the portfolios that we collect, I'm less interested in what they're saying about whales or legalizing marijuana than I am about what they can say about their process and their knowledge of how they put that together and why they put that together and what they learned from it. That to me, that reflective piece is one of the most important pieces of any writing assessment, really. So when we have when we ask them to turn in projects, we don't do it for the writing exercises necessarily, but each time they turn in a project, the expectation is that there's going to be some sort of reflective memo or cover letter on top of it that says, this is what I learned from doing this, because that's what they need to be able to articulate. Not just did they hit all the criteria, but what did they learn about doing it? And if they're able to articulate their learning, even if it's not the best annotated bibliography I've ever seen, but they're able to talk about why and how and the struggle that maybe they had finding sources, and they have that awareness, that's still a strong project, even though they haven't like fully matured into just like this perfect, pristine document.
I would always say share your grading criteria. As much as possible, as often as possible, as early as possible.
Right.
Because again, that makes it more likely they will do what you're wanting to teach them.
Yeah. And I'll say, just for my own practice, it keeps me honest, because I am as susceptible as anybody to really liking this thing for a reason and really not liking that thing for a reason, and not really even being able to articulate why. But that's a trouble spot for instructors, when it's like, oh, so-and-so is getting all the praise and somebody else is not. When really, if you looked at them based on the same list of criteria, I'm maybe being a little harsh with this person or a little bit too generous with this other person. And so for myself, even if I've got a new assignment and it's just kind of a prototype rubric, just forcing myself to articulate what is it that I'm looking for, and even adjusting after I read a few and I'm like, okay, no, like I can see, I've got to adjust this, or, and make these kind of like, that helps me be a better teacher by articulating what those criteria are for myself and for them, so that we're all on the same page.
If there are no further, it's getting close to lunch and I'm famous for being hangry. So